November 19th is International Men's Day, a global occasion to celebrate the positive contributions and diverse experiences of being male. On this day we highlight those inspirational men and boys who help to forge a better world and who show by example how to live with self-respect and integrity in their relationships with other people and with the world around them. On this day we celebrate men's and boys' strengths while taking time to acknowledge their vulnerabilities and needs. We aim to transcend negative stereotyping and encourage greater options and choices for men and indeed for all people. Finally, it's a day for all humanity, providing an opportunity to consider the vast arena of human experience shared by men, women and children alike. Our similarities deserve to be celebrated, as do our differences. With this inclusive vision, International Men's Day seeks to bring a new and healing spirit to the world. On this International Men's Day 2010, we have the great pleasure of talking with Dr. Warren Farrell from his office in Mill Valley, California. Dr. Farrell began his research on gender issues in the 1960s. His first book, The Liberated Man, was published in 1974. It was written from women's and feminist perspectives. By the 1980s, Warren began noticing that men were feeling misrepresented, and his book, Why Men Are the Way They Are, was written to answer women's questions about men in a way that rings true for men. By the 1990s, Dr. Farrell felt the misunderstandings about men had deepened and become dangerous to the survival of families and love. He confronted the misunderstandings head-on with the award-winning book, The Myth of Male Power. Dr. Farrell's most recent research is published as Why Men Earn More: The Startling Truth Behind the Pay Gap and What Women Can Do About It. In this video, Dr. Farrell addresses a common misperception about International Men's Day. The often asked question, but isn't every other day International Men's Day? Aren't gender inequalities taken for granted? Aren't the achievements of the privileged men in politics and culture routinely celebrated? And aren't women's lives and concerns regularly trivialised and marginalised? Why do we need to celebrate International Men's Day when men still rule the world?
Yeah, it's really a very good question to lead off with, because that's the fundamental misunderstanding that leads to a lack of empathy for men. And basically what the world was about until recently was about survival. And what we've done in the last 30 years is we've sort of forgotten that and said, well, it's men who had the power, men who made the rules. Men made the rules to benefit men at the expense of women. And so therefore, in that, if you believe that, and that does appear to be true, because after all, most of the governments are run by men and most of the top corporations are run by men. So the overt manifestation of that appears to be almost self-evident. And so, but here's the flaw in that thinking, that throughout all of history, it was not men who ruled, it was the need to survive that ruled and controlled. And men and women tried to play different roles that led both of them to be disposable in that need to survive. Women had to risk their lives in childbirth to bear children. If they didn't do that, they didn't have the choice to do that or not to do that. Theoretically, they had the choice, but practically speaking, their parents, their families, their communities, their churches, their synagogues, their whatever, all told them they'd get more love, affection, approval, and they'd be more like a woman, like a real woman, if they found a man, raised children most of their lives. Men, conversely, learned the parallel to that, which is it's not your job to raise children, it's your job to raise money so that children can be raised effectively. So women's job, raise children, men's job, raise money. Both of those were not rights, they were obligations, they were responsibilities. They were what you did to become go from girl to woman. They were what you did to go from boy to man. The male version of the male aspect of that disposability was that every society that survived throughout history survived based on its ability to persuade its boys that the way that they became men is to risk disposability in war, to risk disposability in Chilean coal mines, to risk disposability in British petroleum oil rigs, to risk disposability as a lumberjack, as an Alaskan fisherman doing something dangerous in Australia, whatever is hazardous to the health of the man the man was expected to do. But was the man expected to do that? Because what it took to create a healthy society created an unhealthy man. That is, what it took to create a healthy society was to be able to defend that society against invaders. Whether it was Aborigines or Native Americans that couldn't defend their society against invaders, that group of people got taken over. And the people that were the oppressors, if you will, we were the ones that were able to conquer, and we had to be able then to defend what we conquered, or we would be taken over. So who was asked to do that? Men were asked to do that. And the United States is still today the male, the 18-year-old boy who is obligated to register for the draft. No 18-year-old girl is obligated to register for anything. Girls have become the only group of people who have the privilege of voting without any obligation attached to that privilege. And so in many respects, the assumptions of male disposability, the requirements of male disposability, whether the legal obligations to register for the draft or the expectation that if you're a working class man, you're going to work in that coal mine or do something that you can to support the family, those obligations were not called obligations, they were called power. And that's what misled us. That led us to believe that men had the power and women didn't, as opposed to understanding that men had one set of obligations that we call power, and women had another set of obligations that we didn't call powerlessness. We called powerlessness, and that made it seem like the men were powerful and the women weren't. So, for example, men seem to, when boys begin to become men, we start thinking of girls' sexuality. And it seems from the girl's point of view that men have the option of, asking women out and do ask women out, and oftentimes the ones to rape women and date rape women. And so it clearly seems from the girl's point of view that men are powerful and oppressive and only after one thing, sex. But when we look closer, if we're the mother of a son or the father of a son, we see the enormous fear that the boy has in reaching out and experiencing rejection. He's expected at the age of 13 or 14 to risk rejection with girls about whom he knows nothing, and sexually about which he knows almost nothing. And the fears that he has of being rejected are understood by a mother and father watching the 13, 14, 15-year-old boy go through that process. But if you've forgotten about that, or you didn't have a brother that you cared for very much, and you were just tuned into maybe feminist ideology, which said men were oppressors, you started forgetting about those experiences and fears of rejection. And when no one had said to you, if you're a girl, why don't we just reverse this for a while? And why don't we have all girls who grow up be the ones who are expected to risk rejection and ask the boys out? And why don't we have boys' sexuality valued more than girls' sexuality, and boys' physical looks valued more than girls' physical looks? And so then girls would risk rejection to want sex that boys keep in short supply from them. And if they really want it badly enough, they should pay for it by asking the boys out on a date. So they should be involved in the double jeopardy of risking rejection. And then once they've overcome the rejection and gotten some permission to be asked out about something very shameful called sex, we will then have the woman pay for the privilege of being with the boy. Well, no group of women would get together and say, oh, yes, we'll reverse roles with you. We'll take care of that, or at least we'll share roles with you. We'll share not the option of asking boys out, but the expectation of asking boys out. And that's the big difference. So today, what we've created is an era internationally. We have two basic sets of societies: industrialized societies and non-industrialized societies. In industrialized societies, that's the societies where the roles have begun to change. But they've begun to change in the sense that in industrialized societies, there's the option of divorce because the society can afford that. They cannot afford the option of divorce in non-industrialized societies. So in industrialized societies that have the option of divorce, men and women have, that's where once there is divorce, that women have begun to be much more assertive and creating options. And so in those societies, we've developed the era of the multi-option woman and the no-option man. And the most typical everyday multiple option that women have that men don't have is that when the woman is pregnant and she's married, oftentimes, and she's involved with her career, people will sit around the table and say, "Oh my God, you're pregnant. How wonderful." And then they'll start brainstorming the three options she has. Option one is to be full-time involved with the children. Option two is to be full-time involved with the workplace. Option three is to do some combination of both. And her husband sits around and says, option one is, I can work full-time. Option two is I can work full-time. And option three is I can no work full-time. Or if he's a working class man, I can work two jobs. And so we say that he has the power because he's now earning more money than that woman does when he's obligated to work full time. But when I got into a cab some years ago, and a cab driver said to me, what are you talking? I was in the cab with Gloria Steinem going to a radio show, and and the cab driver says, "What are you guys talking about?" Because he knew we were going to a radio show, and we said we're talking about male power. And he goes, "Well, what do you mean by male power?" And I say, "Well, the fact that men have more money and men have more power and influence." He says, "Well, who makes more money, me or my wife?" And I said, "Probably you do." And he said, "Yeah, I make more money than my wife. Absolutely. She gets to stay home, take care of three children. I get out here on the streets of New York City working 70 hours a week. Do you think I'd rather be home with my children or working 70 hours a week in a job and trying to escape being in an accident in New York City?" Well, we got the point. And he said, "You guys must be from academia." so, so he had us figured out in 2 seconds.